Once around the park, James, and don't spare the horses.
Well, we just turned the ignition off. We carpooled. We're all here together in the same location. We're going to have some pops with the boys, and this is one of those things we're doing kind of under the radar. It is On the Ledge. It is the Ontario Politics Podcast. John Wright here has been serving up the beers, and Keith was driving the car, and I'm just making sure that we stay between the curbs. So it's good of you guys to join us. And we did not consult the science table whether or not we were going to be allowed to go on the air this week. But here we are. And we, Keith, surprise, surprise, looking at another 2 weeks. It'll be a full 2 months of stay at home. Not just a shutdown, a stay at home. And when we say that, we're going to kind of come out from the dark on the 2nd of June, maybe. It doesn't mean that we're going to open all the businesses again. It doesn't mean that we're all going to be able to go back and play volleyball on the beach. It just means you can leave your house.
If we're lucky. June 2nd, remember, the Premier announced an extension, a 2-week extension of the stay-at-home, don't-leave-it order. But the science table was recommending 4 weeks. And so the concern is, of course, that, as they said, we didn't really end the second wave before we went into the third. So they want to make sure the third wave is over to make sure there isn't a fourth. So therefore, I think June 2nd is actually optimistic at this point. But to your point about staying at home, it's too early in the day for some brown pops or barley pops. We know what the Premier was getting at, but boy, I think when he was asked a straight-up question about opening golf courses and tennis courts and other outdoor activities, and he responded with an anecdote about how buddies like to gather and have a couple of pops after 18 holes, he really missed the point, and it was a bad communications error. I know he was trying to relate it on a human level, but if he doesn't have science to back up the data, and the science table is apparently saying it is perfectly safe to open up the golf courses, to let these things happen, as long as people are socially responsible. We know the Premier's thing is trying to stop gatherings outside. People have been very responsible so far. I think they can be trusted with a round of golf, a game of tennis, some shooting, some hoops, or whatever it is necessary to get out of the house. It's been 14 months. This was a big communications error for him. But again, he's just ignoring the science. And when asked specific questions about how we're looking forward, when are we going to reopen, he just starts attacking the federal government all of a sudden. It's just become a partisan issue. It's the borders. It's the airports. That you didn't get us enough vaccines. This is all the wrong messaging. People want to see their governments getting along, and they also want to see some plans going forward. Instead, we've seen another extension of the lockdown, the stay-at-home. But when asked if he's going to do anything to enforce it, because people are fed up, and he was talking, Dave, I noticed you talked, the summation of Randy Rath's question from CHCH was, there could be civil disobedience. Are you going to step up enforcement on the long May 2-4 weekend? And he just pivoted onto attack on the federal government and what they hadn't done. As I say, I think these were mass communications errors, and people are looking for something. We've talked about this before, looking forward. Give us some guidance, seeing where we're going to go. Okay, if you're shutting us down for 2 weeks, he was asked specifically, what numbers, where do we need to be so that we can see some opening up? There were no specific answers, and then he was punted to Dr. Williams, who, as usual, made the clarification more muddy.
He says a lot of words.
He uses a lot of them, but he doesn't make it really clear.
Yeah. John?
I think I take away a few things from the press conference. First of all, it was the first time that the Premier's really given a press conference, and I think it was well managed. I think that, yes, he got kind of Doug Ford anecdotal about a lot of stuff, but David Williams right afterwards did talk about the golf situation and how people gather before and afterwards. Like, he actually did expand the conversation a little bit. But David Williams also made it clear, and he did so before in the previous conference, that we aren't going to really see anything open unless we get under 1,000 cases a day. So we've still got a long way to go on this. And I think we're going to come to an inflection point where enough people have enough jabs in their arms that we're going to see things kind of drop off. But I think the Premier, I was thinking the other day, Dave, how do you best describe what the Premier's role is? And it's like being in a fast food restaurant where you've got kind of like all the employees on the front line serving the French fries, and then you've got the manager, or you've got the supervisor next, and then you got the manager, and then you have the regional manager, and then you have the boss. And the boss is in charge of all the franchises and all that sort of stuff. And the question is, when does the boss come out? I mean, the boss doesn't come out every day when somebody, feels that their french fries need to be replaced. There's a hierarchy where people come out and say certain things. And Doug Ford is always going to be Doug Ford, and he's going to be anecdotal and be folksy and, all that sort of stuff. And sometimes he's not even on message. He just kind of goes in his own direction. But he's picked an issue which clearly resonates with the public. It's around the airports. And he's premier-like in the sense that he's dealing with the Prime Minister. The thing I noticed the most about that and the border issue was he did not refer to the Prime Minister as the Prime Minister. He's echoing the Tory ads. He's echoing Aaron O'Toole. He referred to him as Justin Trudeau. That was an inflection that I hadn't noticed before when he was attacking it. So it does resonate with the public. People do believe that we have people coming in over the border, and he's chosen that issue about 3 weeks ago, that's the one he's going to be on. But he had it all backed up. He said, I sent the first letter in December. I did this. That's his issue. It's clear to me. But he's laying down markers for whatever election campaign is coming out. They're sending out fundraising, notes around that sort of stuff. And I think he did a good job by just coming on, staying in his box, and getting off the stage. And he didn't do any damage.
The problem with that, though, is, yes, I think all of a sudden, this is like the frog in the boiling water. I mean, we're just kind of getting used to all of this, and we're starting to hear it. And to some degree, I think we are really tuning it out, because to both your points, he was not talking about what was coming from the science table. It is clear the Premier does not listen to the science table. Stop right there. So stop saying you believe in the science, because they are clearly saying it's okay to be outdoors and with some issue and deal with some of those activities. And if it's a mobility issue, John, you and I here in the middle of the Toronto, in downtown Toronto, you and I could almost walk to a good golf course near us. Never mind driving. We could walk to an outdoor tennis court. We could go and play basketball in a local schoolyard somewhere. So it's not about getting a bunch of people in a van and driving halfway across the province to play golf. The mobility issue is a red herring, and it would be really easy. Listen, if you're going to do it, just do it within the confines of your own municipality. So they are not listening to the science table. And so to your point, this is clearly has just become political messaging. And that's where we left off last week about what is a populist politician. June the 2nd was a populist decision, because if we were going to get below 10 or below 1,000, I saw graphs this week from the science table that said that becomes possible on June the 10th. Well, guess what? That's another week out from where we have already put the pin on the map.
But I'm interested in Keith responding to this. Okay, so on the left-hand side of the screen is the Minister of Health, so it's a political figure. And on the right-hand side of the screen is Dr. Williams, who is the Chief Medical Officer, who basically backed up everything that the Premier said. Like he did. Like he talked about the socialization. He said, we're not really concerned about when they're on the course. We're concerned about, beforehand, afterwards, people get together and congregate and all that sort of. Okay, so, I mean, who's at fault here? Is it the Premier, or is it David Williams, who's basically like a hand puppet, kind of mouthing the words that the Premier said?
Well, Dr. Williams aside, I mean, we've had issues with him. We've raised them, talked about them before. And again, here, he does seem to be the enabler, if you will, when the Premier makes political decisions that seem to go against the broader science table recommendations, or at least what we're hearing from those that are on the science table. They seem to be disagreeing many times with the Premier, whereas Dr. Williams does not. But I think, John, to your point about the issue that the Premier has latched on here, even though the facts say that only 1.1% of the COVID variants that are coming in came in through international flights, there is something to be said when 1/3 of international travelers are avoiding quarantine, and we don't know why, and what rules are being applied to exempt them, and why are the rules not the same for everyone, and still, why are there so many international flights? Why so many domestic flights? I think a lot of Canadians are wondering about this and do question it so far into the pandemic, why there's still so many flights. And they agree that the border controls could still be tighter. So Ford has latched onto something here, but he's latched onto it as a clear deflection from the third wave being worse in Ontario than it needed to be because he opened up too early. This is really a matter of A, political blame game, and B, the election's only 12 months away. The federal election could be sooner, and both sides are sharpening up their knives to who's Ford going to campaign against. They don't even know who the Liberals are. He's going to campaign against Trudeau, and Trudeau is going to campaign against Doug Ford. He did it last time very effectively. He's going to do it again.
Imagine politics being played here. I also work in numbers where we do public opinion polls, and I'm the first one to point out that when 13% of people across this country are anti-vaxxers, it's, you can look at that and say, well, 70 to 90% in that range or not, depending upon how you ask the question. But then you say, well, 13%, how many people is that? Well, when you got 30 million adults, it's, 3.5 million people. I mean, that's okay. So that, when you're talking about 1.7% of the people coming through an airport, he actually is giving numbers, not percentages. So he was talking about over 3,500 people who've tested positive when they've come off of those planes. And then I'm reminded where you're sitting down in the East Coast, Keith. I'm reminded of the fact that the outbreak in Nova Scotia is due to one family from Toronto. One family who decided not to quarantine. They flew down there, they had a barbecue, they invited 50 people, and the whole province now is shut down and it's out of control. They can't stop it. So when you go to Maritimes, don't tell people you're from Toronto. Find another place that your ancestors came from. But I can actually connect with the Premier's view, and that is that 3,700 people or thereabouts are coming into Ontario, and they're going to live somewhere, and they're not all going to their quarantine stations. And in fact, we had a huge outbreak at one, which demonstrated that there are some problems, and we don't know where they go after that. That's a very street-level approach to this thing. So, again, if a family can go down to Nova Scotia and shut down the whole province after a month because it all started there and they were stupid, well, then you got 3,700 people landing here in Toronto, going elsewhere, and I can only imagine a very small percentage of those people actually make it to a hotel for quarantine. Like, it's an easy target, but there's also a concern that I would have anywhere.
Well, but here's the problem that we're having with this discourse between Trudeau and Ford, though, is that they're both pointing fingers at each other saying, well, Trudeau's saying, if you want, we're happy to talk, but we've got a bunch of exemptions here that you have asked for, so people can come into Ontario. Now, it's right back, John, we are right back at the argument of we need to do testing, we need to do contact tracing, and we need to provide places for people to quarantine or sick pay. And we're still all dancing all around that, hoping that we're going to vaccinate our way out of this. So now we're at a point where they have said, well, we're not going to use AstraZeneca for the first dose anymore. We're sitting on a surplus. By the middle of next week, there's going to be a huge surplus of AstraZeneca. They still can't figure out whether or not or how, guys like you and I are going to get our second dose of AstraZeneca while there's still supply available to us. So they're losing on both ends. I mean, they're not able to vaccinate our way out of this, and we're just going to kind of wait this out and hope that somehow the finger pointing is going to somehow cleanse them of any kind of accountability in all this.
You know what? I think, though, I look at it a little bit differently, Dave, and that is that I look at issues going in cycles, and I think we're at the end of the response stage and the beginning of the recovery stage. And I think, you're right on the AstraZeneca. Well, we're not the only province to have suspended it. It's been suspended out west and in other places too. So, I mean, there is a pause for concern. And if I had a way to go at this, I would just say, look, you can have informed consent. I mean, if you were in the front of the line, and I was kind of in the front of the line for this shot outside of the long-term care homes, and so if I got a notice from Rexall Drugs today saying, if you want it, you can have it, but you got to sign off, and I go and get it today. Doesn't matter. I'm done. But I guess the noise that was there 3 weeks ago, the screaming and the yelling, and just before he went into his mother's house, the Premier was attacked from all sides, everywhere. I put my head up this week, and it's kind of like, this is what we're talking about? I mean, it's quiet. The screaming is all stopped. You get a few people going here and there, but it's quiet. He's not taking the heat in the same way. He didn't rise to the bait in the House. He's gone inside. It's quieted down. And I do think, honestly, that within the next 30 days, we're going to turn that channel onto the recovery phase, because naturally you're going to have jabs and arms enough to do that, and people are starting to get back into it. That's when other decisions are going to have to be made. And I would say the first thing is, you got to get ready to change that cabinet, man. There's got to be some changes to get rid of those people. There's tired soldiers in the front lines, and move some fresh troops in. Number two, that's when you start framing where you're going to be a year from now. You know, the House will be prorogued anyways, and you got to put your speeches in the economic city. Turn the page. I think we're going to be able to turn the page right across the whole board. Even Scott Moe has done it already in Saskatchewan. I think it's actually only a few weeks away.
Ironically, of course, the Premier was accused of being in hiding when he didn't have enough daily news conferences, and when he skipped the big transit announcement with the federal government, he was accused of being in hiding, as opposed to, I think, as John's advice has been for many weeks, if not months now, the Premier should step back and let cabinet ministers step into the fray and take some of the heat and some of the responsibility for this. So, of course, he did that. He was immediately criticized for it, but I think it was a smart play overall. He wasn't taking as much. John said things have calmed down. But then someone looking into this, Colin DeMello, one of our favorite of our program here, looking into this, got someone to say, well, yeah, it is a strategy. We do want to do this. And he got someone to give the terrible quote, "We want to protect the king." Boy, talk about undermining your entire campaign to protect the king by calling him the king. I know it's in-house rhetoric, but to let it go out even as an unsourced or an unnamed quote, it just does damage when damage didn't need to be done. The strategy, as one of the great communication advisors, I know advisors of the Tories, Paul Rhodes said, act your strategy. Don't tell your strategy.
So, if they back to the AstraZeneca and towards your strategy,
give me my shot.
Though.
Give me my second shot.
Well, exactly. So here's, again, if the Premier wants to play games with the Prime Minister, then he should turn Ontario into a 2-dose summer, because he's got the opportunity to get that on track right now. And to say out loud, okay, between now and the 1st of July, we're going to get rid of all these AstraZeneca doses, and there's at least, 250,000 people who are going to have the 2 doses, and we're well on our way. And so those are the positive things that I think back to recovery, back to strategy, that they should be doing. And I don't get a hint that there's a plan for that at all, John.
Well, there may not be, but I mean, this now falls in the lap of David Williams. I mean, he made the decision sitting at home, on camera, making a decision. We're going to go for a pause. How long are you going to go for? What's the pause all about? The AstraZeneca Pfizer report, which I actually read on Lancet. Couldn't understand half the damn thing, but it basically says you can mix and match these things, and you're going to have, for some people, it's going to be, depending upon age, it's going to have more symptoms when you get it, but it seems to be safe enough. But the fact that other provinces have suspended this, if they hadn't done it, would have left them open for a lot of other criticism as well. But I'm with you in the sense that I think if they've got this stockpile of stuff, I think there's going to be an undercurrent where people will say, look, if you give me informed consent to get the shot, then you're off the hook. I'll take the shot. Like even the
Williams is already saying it's a 1 in a million problem if you take the second shot with AstraZeneca. So he's already got the science in his head. I don't get it. Why are we waiting?
Well, because I don't know either, except that he said we're going to take a pause, and I think the pause is going to be probably the next 10 days, and he's going to say, yeah, we've decided that we're going to do this. It may be a simple effect of them actually figuring out not what you do with the 350,000 doses that you get, because there's something like 600 or 700,000 people actually got the shot. It may be about the people in the gap that you're worried about. I mean, no, those are the people who are going to have to mix and match, and frankly, there may be a bit of a stampede to get the shot so that they don't have to. But I think that's more of the issue. What do we do with those people who were left over? And I think that's where the Pfizer AstraZeneca report is due in June. It's not that long from now, and if those AstraZeneca shots can sit in the fridge until then, they may be in a position then to say, okay, this is a solution, this is how we're going to do it, science is backing that up. I think they're just caught in a pause.
Let's get on to the big, you already alluded to it, Keith, the transit announcement. $12 billion from the feds. Any other day of the week, that would be the lead story out of Queen's Park. It just becomes this sort of low buzz sort of, discussion. Well, primarily because all of these projects are already underway for the most part. The shovels are already in the ground. We're talking about extensions to current projects or ones that we certainly here in Toronto have been talking about for years. And I don't think people realized that the feds hadn't put up any money yet. So, this big revelation that it took us this long to come to an agreement, where the hell have you been on it? So it was kind of a double-edged sword, I think, for them.
Well, that's exactly it. I mean, what we've got is federal money going into 5 major existing transit projects or transit lines in Toronto, the 5th being the Hamilton LRT. And here's where they did something really interesting. The feds in the province are coming up with 3.4 billion total, 50-50 each. The city is going to have to cover just the operating costs. They're going to build the LRT from McMaster University to Eastgate Square in the almost in Stony Creek in the east end of the city. That's exactly what the city, or a good chunk of the city, wanted. But politically, they did something this time because Hamilton this would go back to Hamilton City Council, where there's an awful lot of people. The city is split, of course, because of what they call the mountain, the upper part of the city. They don't see any benefits from the LRT. The far suburban areas that have been amalgamated into Hamilton, they don't see a benefit. So there's a fear Hamilton would, again, screw this up. It's been going on so long, the artist rendering has Blockbuster Video Store in it for the LRT. And so the feds in the province, the city council will debate the bus rapid transit as an alternative. And the feds, no, there's no alternative. This is the project for an LRT, or there's no $3.4 billion. So Hamilton City Council now has to decide whether they're going to cover the operating costs, which are still unclear at this point. But boy, they better come up with that, and they better come up with it in a hurry. It has spurred, the LRT in Kitchener-Waterloo has spurred so much investment. And Hamilton is in desperate need of it. And of course, a good chunk of the land was bought up by Metrolinx, or the houses, and they're boarded up and they're chained off. The city needs to develop this, and it's probably the most shovel-ready thing that the feds can get their money into, and Hamilton can get on with this. So it's a necessary project for everyone, a huge infrastructure project, and would create a lot of jobs, certainly in the construction. So there's a lot positive for it, but I thought it was very politically, very smart move to basically say to Hamilton City Council, it's for the LRT. You're not taking this money and doing anything else with it. This is what the project is. Smart move. And Premier Ford wasn't there. This is the other thing. The 4 subway lines, these were Premier Ford's subway plans, the extension. This was all what he was doing, and he wasn't there for it. I think that politically he must have been choking back a bit to do that, but he did it, and he let his transportation ministers, let them go out and make the proper announcements. It was a smart move.
These are all lawn darts for a campaign. I mean, does anybody believe we're ever going to see any of this money? At least now they can go into the 905 where Frank Scarpetti, the mayor of Markham, stood up and cheered so loud they've almost drowned everybody out. Thank you for sending us the money. I mean, for goodness sake, behind the scenes here, there's 2 different worlds in Canada right now. There's a world that you and I are living in and dealing with COVID every day and, worrying about whether golf clubs open or our family's going to be able to work or keeping our restaurants open. That's our world. And then there's a federal government world that says, you know what, despite all of that, we have to fund this and we have to open that and we have to have a budget that does this. Like, it's on a totally different level, and all they're doing is it's a big calendar and a big map overplaced each other. And it's kind of like, well, the 905, we need to strengthen that so we can get those votes. Bang. We need Hamilton. Bang. We need Scarborough. Bang. It's kind of like, there you go. So I don't think that the federal government is going to change over the next period of time. They're going to keep doing this because it's laying out their campaign. The question is whether any of that stuff mattered. And I look at this as a Torontonian, and my first reaction was, well, thanks for the money for the subway that will probably never be built, but my city is still in debt, and I would have liked to have bailed them out. I mean, I still, I look at these numbers every day from across the country, and what people are thinking is very surly out there. People are very upset. And I think we're still looking down right in the next 2 weeks in front of us. I mean, there's economic confidence indices across this country that ask people, where do you think the economy is going to be in the next in the next year? And that's where the economic confidence indices are all built around. My stuff is all the next month. Like, do you think your economy is going to improve in the next month in your community? Like, we're right down at street level, and these guys are somewhere else. So I just think that's all politics, and I think Doug Ford didn't go out there because he knew it was all politics, and he just wants to deal with. That's why, the press conference, Justin Trudeau. That's what that's all about, in my view.
Well, on the other side of this, though, talking about politics and elections, so it was not by accident and timing that Quebec, I think, Keith, presents its new bill to reinforce support for French culture, French language in that province. And what I found most interesting is that from the calls within Quebec that the Legault government did not go far enough in some of those protections. Now we're talking about constitutional amendments, and my head starts to explode because we're of an age where we covered all of that nonsense back in the 80s and in the 90s. And, if you haven't lived through that, oh my God, you talk about political pain. So all of this is going to be injected into what is going to be a federal campaign. Again, playing one off against the other, Quebec off against Ontario. I don't know whether or not the Prime Minister's got that capability or not.
Well, if you're old enough to remember the debate about the language law, you'll remember it was known as Bill 101. And that bill lives on in infamy in most Canadians' minds, certainly in most non-Quebecers. TREC, they used to call it, the rest of Canada, TROC. Just shocked by that language law. And yet here we are, decades later, with a new one that goes even further and wants to expand the restrictions on the use of English to smaller groups, and requires a constitutional amendment. Something any of us that have covered Meech Lake or any of the other constitutional discussions in this country know. Boy, talk about circular firing squads. It's just a giant waste of money and time, unless you have something clear, and this is not something clear that the rest of the country is going to agree on. It's never going to get through, but it will sidetrack a federal election, put all the spotlight back on Quebec, where everybody loves to see it in a federal election. It's a smart move by the Quebec government. It's something that I think, as you say, Dave, surprisingly, many Quebecers think doesn't go far enough. So there's a lot of home support for it right there. That's going to put it in the federal campaign. How do you sort this one out? How do you juggle Quebec's difference, if you will, on this particular issue? It's a difficult one for everyone to handle, and yet Quebec is going to go through. I mean, it's their national pride. They want to protect their national language, and it's a hard political issue for non-Quebecers.
Well, John, the 101, I heard Thomas Mulcair on the radio this week, and he said in the day we called it Bill 401 because everybody headed down the 401 to Ontario once this 101 came into effect. So the effort to preserve the culture and the language is one thing, but if you look at it and if it has a similar effect, all of a sudden we're already in a tough economic situation. You start driving businesses and people out of the province. That's not a good combination.
Well, I suppose you and I lived through that. And the thing that I think now is I think of my own kids and other millennials have never had anything about that. And so there's this it's almost like Charlie Brown's teacher speaking when anything of that's going on next door. It's like wah, wah, wah. I mean, they've talked about religious symbols. They've attacked, all kinds of other things here. I don't know how it's going to play into Ontario. But to your point, Dave, on trade, I think that is the underlying issue that everybody's missing. I mean, if you look at world trade even, it is down so substantially. It's going to take an awful lot for that to come back. And we should be opening up borders to make sure within this country that when the recovery begins again, that we don't have people fleeing regions, that we have people sending things to regions. So I don't think the language issue is going to be a big thing. I just think that the tone is going to change in this country in the next month. And those sort of things are going to be seen as somebody else's problems and not ours. Just absolutely.
All right.
not.
Well, we're looking at nice weather here, so get yourself a couple of pops and enjoy the great outdoors this weekend. So that'll do it. This is the On the Ledge. It's the Ontario Politics Podcast with Keith Leslie, John Wright. I'm Dave Trafford, and this is an Eye Contact Podcast.